History has a negative canthal tilt. It's over for history. We have reached the final form of human government.
The Indian sort of political system is not one to bet on. The Chinese government is preparing for war with Taiwan. Is that economically rational? Is that
The American model is going to adopt the competitive characteristics of the Chinese economy.
God, can you stop doing drugs for like 3 friggin' seconds? God, Greg, you're always jonesing.
But I have a question for JJ. Why do you think that neoliberalism happened?
Welcome back to the Greg Brogan Experience, the only podcast that, Today on the show, we have JJ McCullough and Joshua Citarella, my two mentors. JJ is my centrist status quo mentor, and Joshua Citarella is my based anti-centrist mentor. These are two old men that have greatly influenced me in my career and in my thoughts. Although JJ and Josh have a lot of pretty substantive philosophical disagreements, they're also very respectful of each other as fellow old men, and they have very good conversations. So we were very excited about this one. We cover a kind of insane amount of ground on this one, but our main topic of conversation is just ideology. Does it actually matter? Does it do anything? Is the internet important? Does anything ever happen? Also, my audio cuts out near the end half of this, but I also barely talk, so it doesn't really matter. And you should expect this from us at this point anyway. We will have Mr. Beast on and be chewing nicotine gum into the mics. Wow, one of the mics just cuts out. But yeah, I think half our job here is just to find interesting people that would have good in-person conversations and bring them together on a couch and then record it for money. So this episode's a masterclass in that. We're here with my two mentors, JJ McCullough and Joshua Citarella. Would you like to give a brief explanation of who you guys are to set up the conflicts that will be emerging in this podcast?
I'm JJ. I'm a YouTuber and journalist.
No, this is irrelevant information. I'll do the introduction. JJ McCullough, my first mentor. He is a shill for the status quo, and he is very grounded in real-world politics. He thinks ideology doesn't matter at all. Joshua Citarella, you can try to introduce yourself, and if you do a bad job, then I'll interrupt.
Oh, goodness. I'm an artist and an internet culture writer, and I interview people who have very extreme politics and are very young.
Yes.
They're into memes, YouTube, all sorts of weird content online, and I am perhaps in this podcast arguing on behalf of shitposting radicals on the internet. I think that's our dynamic today.
Yeah, Josh is very entertained and interested by ideology in a way that JJ is not interested in. And this is kind of the core conflict that I want to explore via my two mentors. I met Josh. Josh wrote an internet piece called Instagram and the Post Left.
Politogram
and the Post Left. And it was just kind of an exploration of how these ideologies form online and where they're headed and that kind of stuff. So I think this is a very interesting conflict. I think this is going to be our best episode yet. And I'm locking it in as truth.
It's true.
It's true.
You will get a lot from this.
Yes.
I think you'll come at the other end of this being a better person and a better listener and a better thinker.
Yeah. I think this is probably a good place to start. Does ideology matter? Is it important?
My inclination is to say no. I feel like people in this life will often use ideology to give a sort of respectable gloss to what are often just kind of like baser human instincts. Instincts of, jealousy, resentment, disgust, greed, envy, an impulse towards violence, vindictiveness, these just sort of basic human instincts that have been with us forever.
They can all be pathologized away.
I think to some degree. And I think that, for example, we often have this argument, like sort of right-wingers will sort of poke fun at left-wingers when they'll sort of say like, communism killed millions of people. And then the stereotypical left-winger says, well, actually, that wasn't true communism. Stalin was some sort of other sort of deviation from what communist theory was supposed to be. And it's like, yeah, maybe that's true. And maybe that just shows us that even like a committed communist like Stalin was ultimately motivated by things larger than the ideology, right? Maybe this doesn't really maybe this just ultimately shows that even a fundamentally ideological dictatorship isn't actually motivated that much by ideology because humans are ultimately not motivated much by ideology. Maybe academics are, maybe people that study ideology for a living take this kind of stuff seriously, but in terms of how it actually plays out in the real world, I think that sort of a lot of the great ideological dictatorships of the 20th century were probably more just dictatorships of a sort that we've seen throughout all of human history rather than expressions of, particular ideologies put into practice.
Now, Josh, you and I are very interested in ideology.
Yes.
And so you'd think that interest comes from some place of getting some real value out of what these people are thinking. Oftentimes kids and stuff, when they're growing up on the internet.
Yes, I would say that the question is, does ideology matter?
Yes.
And I would say that probably for the past, let's say, about 30 years, the answer may have been no. That Thomas Frank has a great book about this called Listen Liberal, which was about the shift in the Democratic Party in the United States and the emergence of something called the Third Way. Third Way was a drift from the parties that previously represented labor constituencies in the advanced industrialized world that moved incrementally towards finance to shore themselves up with donors. This is the type of Clinton, Obama, and this type of lineage. You could even throw in like Macron, Tony Blair, this type of like neoliberal but progressive. And I would say that we've seen a shattering of that third way consensus, and ideology has once again become very influential and will shape the 21st century. So my particular field of interest is the history of the 20th century, solving what we would call the calculation debate, which is this fundamental disagreement between socialists and liberals about how to best provision society and distribute resources, whether through markets or planning. And we can get deep in the weeds with that again, as we discussed some on the previous episode. But the history of the 20th century, just speaking in very, very broad strokes here, is that fascism actually existed, socialism actually existed. Post 1989, there's this famous essay by Francis Fukuyama who says that history has a negative canthal tilt. It's over for history. We have reached the final form of human government. Liberal democracy is the only form for human society, and that continues forever into the future, meaning that ideological conflict is over. And we've seen post-2008 is where I would attribute it to, in the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States, the self-managing economic model proved itself incapable of self-management. It had this crash through over-financialization, and its own tools that were supposed to keep it in check failed to do that. What we've seen rising since then are populist movements on both the left and right, and those things, in some cases, use fascism and socialism as the ideologies through which they describe themselves. We can compare that to the 20th century, whether those are robust forms of it, whether they're LARPs and things like this. But I would say that, again, we are now in this period where we don't have a viable political economic model to solve society's crises for the 21st century. And so ideology is, again, becoming influential, and that will shape the years following, 2020, 2024, and so on.
Yes, as the status quo crumbles, new ideologies emerge from the rubble in order to dictate a new future for us.
Yes.
Make very exciting time
I would
to be
agree.
alive.
No, but that's, when you were sort of, what I thought was interesting was when you sort of said, like, sort of socialists and liberals having conversations about what works, right? And doesn't that basically mean that as we sort of move further away from ideology, we're just all pragmatists now? Like, we're very much sort of focused on not sort of formulating public policy based on some high-minded idea of what things should be in a sort of pure and, sort of utopian world. We're just kind of like looking at case studies of what works, what doesn't work, what does the data suggest, the data suggests will be a good idea versus a bad idea and all that. That to me sort of suggests that, technocracy and all this kind of stuff, it gets a bad name, but it does sort of feel like one of the lessons of the 20th century is that if we believe ideology to be discredited by, the bad examples that we've seen or the failures of ostensibly ideological governments to, deliver the goods, doesn't that mean that we'd be more close-minded to new attitudes towards government that purport to be ideological solutions rather than just pragmatic ones?
The labels we use to describe some of these economic models may be insufficient for the way that things actually move in the world today. I would say that organizations such as Amazon and Walmart and Google and things that platform economies, broadly speaking, have resolved the Hayek's knowledge problem, which was the great stumbling block for the Soviet Union that would do their economic planning through literally pencil and paper, and they were never able to achieve the productivities of a market economy. the situation we are in now is that some of these very large organizations like Amazon, Walmart, and Google derive synthetic price on a daily basis, and that has been happening for about, the past decade, the past 15 years. And if you look at the size of an organization such as Walmart, they are using a planned economy that is larger than the United States, has a greater GDP, larger than the Soviet Union, has a greater GDP than the Soviet Union, and so they have achieved the dreams of the Soviet Gosplan. They've done economic planning.
But they're not doing that on the basis of ideology. They're not saying this is like our philosophy for how to run this. They're doing this presumably because it works or because it makes some sort of pragmatic sense, right? Mm-hmm. So even though you can sort of say, like, you can sort of say that in some ways this represents a kind of central planning that maybe evokes the kind of the ideological government that we saw in the Soviet times, what you're describing in terms of a large corporation, its own sort of style of central planning is not an ideologically driven approach to business management.
It can be even precisely the opposite sometimes, which is that these people would rhetorically describe themselves as being triumphant capitalists, but then they're not allowing market transactions and competition in their logistical supply chains and so on. So that it's a very interesting moment. What I would say, though, is that as this conflict opens up, the assumption that the technocrats or the elites who are in charge of this type of political economic organization of society, they themselves are imbued with an ideology that is the subject of their class position. And so when the opportunities present themselves to do more comprehensive planning, they are often reluctant to do that. And so the forces that will emerge to make, in my particular view onto this, the necessary class power to engage in a struggle with those economies, to make them work for everyone, to introduce democratic inputs into the logistical situation of Amazon, for example. Do we want infant formula and diapers to be delivered overnight? Most likely. Do we want consumer goods such as phone cases and things that are not necessary for your immediate survival? Do we want them to be delivered so efficiently that people have to work in undignified positions and pee in buckets and stuff like this? Probably not. And so the forces that emerge are going to need to have some type of vision that is larger than themselves. And at the present moment, they call themselves socialists, or they call themselves right-wing populists, or in some cases fascists. But those people who are organizing from the fringes to affect the decisions of those technocrats, kind of counter their class position, they are ideological, and they read Marx. They read. There's a theory that subtends their political actions in the real world. So I will. I think I'll meet you halfway on this, in that there may be some goods that we want to have distributed through markets, and that may be actually the most efficient and preferable way of doing it, particularly in the realm of consumer goods like music and movies and things like this. But in terms of the necessary goods of survival of food, housing, transportation, and so on, those things are not going to be provided in the form of universal basic services purely on their own, without a class antagonist that rivals those technocratic decisions, and they will likely call themselves socialists, I think.
I was with Josh until he said he'll meet him halfway.
I mean, it's just I still, I guess, I sort of fail to see how that's ideological as opposed to just being pragmatic, right? Like, for example, in this country, in Canada, right, you have a public health insurance provider, there's a sort of public health insurance provider monopoly in basically all the provinces that cover all of the essential services. You want to get essential healthcare needs covered, you have to get it covered by the public health insurance plan. Even sort of conservative politicians in this country support that. They don't support it because they're socialists. They don't support it because they have a sort of socialist ideology that makes them believe that this is the most efficient way to allocate a resource like health insurance. They do it because we've had that in place for several decades. It seems to work. It seems to be broadly popular. There's no reason to sort of disrupt that particular status quo. So that's not like an ideological conclusion. That's just a pragmatic assessment of what has been shown to work through trial and error. And so, like, I just kind of feel like a lot of the times politicians, political activists, actors, when in power, I think significantly, when people are on the margins, when people are sort of professional activists, they can, perhaps be a little bit more LARPy and take their ideological identities more seriously. But when you have actually politicians elected to power making decisions, I do think that far more of them are animated by a sort of sense of pragmatism than they are by, some sort of core sort of philosophical, first principles.
All right. Brogan, let me know if I'm switching topics too quickly and if they should keep going, but I'm going to, lots of battlegrounds here to address.
I wanted to zoom out maybe a little bit first.
Okay.
Because I'm wondering, like, I'm thinking about the difference between, like, ideology and culture, right? If you could draw a line between those two concepts, where people are backing, you know, people who back Trump, for example, like a populist right.
Yeah.
They're not, like, ideologically populist. It's a cultural populism.
Yes.
Right? So what is the distinction between ideology and culture, the history of it, where, like, the culture emerges naturally throughout years? Because, like, no one unites on... There's no, like, city built on ideology. There's no, like, country built on ideology. All of our collective agreements are, like, cultural agreements. They're not ideological agreements necessarily, right?
Can I just give a very, very cut and dry example of culture versus ideology?
Yeah.
So if you were to juxtapose Reagan and Thatcher as being neoliberals versus Obama and Tony Blair or something like that, all four of those people could be described as neoliberals because they believe that markets are the best way to distribute the resources in society. The role of the state is to manage those markets and to, in some cases, create them, right? Obamacare was creating a marketplace for healthcare. But the cultural values of Reagan and Thatcher versus Obama and Blair, very different, right? Very different on progressive issues, very different on the role of the family, traditional ways of organizing society. And although they have a cultural separation that is quite clear, they are both ideologically neoliberals. They have the same kind of economic model. And so to me, that demonstrates the slottability of some of these belief systems, that there are many cultures that can accommodate neoliberal economic policy. And you can find clear cultural distinctions between various examples.
And of course, just to be explicit here, JJ is a neoliberal shell. And Josh is critical of neoliberalism.
Would you describe yourself as neoliberal?
No, because I again...
You don't think ideology exists.
Well, I mean, I think...
I'm just right about it.
No, I mean, like, neoliberal...
Which is the most neoliberal thing to do.
But see, I mean, like, this is one of the revealing things about ideological discourse, is that a lot of times these are terms that other people apply to other people rather than terms that people use to describe themselves. You know, I don't think that, Tony Blair spent a lot of time going around calling himself a neoliberal or thinking of himself as a neoliberal, or when he went down to sort of make decisions about what kind of government was best for Great Britain, he thought, well, what is the most neoliberal thing to do? You know, I think that he thought of himself as like a sort of moderate sort of social democrat that was part of a certain social democratic cultural tradition in Great Britain. He had a sort of assessment that the more doctrinaire attempts to sort of impose socialist solutions in Britain had failed based on the practices of the Labour Party governments of the past in the 20th century in Britain. And so he had a sort of more moderate approach to how to run things in the UK that made more peace with markets than previous Labour Party prime ministers had done in the past. You know, I think that this is kind of the story of the 20th century, is that people were perhaps at one time more ideological. Maybe I'll take back what I said in the beginning, that, like, you know, everyone has always sort of just been LARPing ideology. I mean, I do think it has been overrated in the grand scheme of things, but I mean, I do sort of agree with what you also sort of said, is that in the last 30 years, we've sort of seen a move away from it. But I think what is the mischaracterization is that I think a lot of people on the left, you know, particularly the academic left, instead of sort of like accurately characterizing that move away from sort of doctrinaire ideology, particularly doctrinaire socialist ideology, they've sort of framed it as the adoption of this new terrifying ideology that's called neoliberalism. And that now we're kind of like under the boot of this like ideology that is even more dogmatic than socialism ever was, and that sort of like we're now in the thrall of these governments that are like hyper ideological. And I think that the reason why a lot of left-wingers talk that way is because this is an attempt to do a kind of like judo move on like their critics on the right, who accuse them of being ideological and say, like, you know, you're a socialist, and then the folks on the left can say, well, you're a neoliberal, and in many ways you're the true ideologue here. So I just kind of think a lot of this is just politics, a lot of this is just theater, and a lot of it is ways to kind of like discredit people that we don't agree with by framing them as ideologues, which has become a kind of slur.
A friend of mine once told me that it's difficult to see the ideology of your times while you're in them. And I think the emergence of neoliberalism, or I should say the reemergence of neoliberalism as a self-professed ideology, is one of the indications that this period is actually coming to a close. So I would say that between 1947, with the meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, up until the mid-70s, neoliberalism was a self-professed ideology because people gathered under that title and they created the theory and the institutions and the lobbying groups and the universities that taught this thing. But then from roughly 1980 up until 2020, that would be the period I isolate, there wasn't an ideology as neoliberalism because it just was the consensus. It was the way of doing things. And what we've seen in the following years, particularly after 2016, I would say a large part of this is also just the mass adoption curve of the internet. If you roll back the clock to like 2012, that's when your mom, dad, aunt, and uncle all get on Facebook. You just see the adoption curve of Facebook go up, up, and up. Everybody's online. And so a lot of people start to think about this stuff. It starts to shape how they organize online. And then you see things like r/neoliberal, where people are self-described neoliberals. And there even is an intra-liberal dispute where the classical liberals, for example, would refuse to bail out companies that were failing. But the neoliberals might think that, well, they're too big to fail. We need to uphold the economy. And so the state should step in at this
JJ literally
point.
follows people who are self-described neoliberals and are like, so true, agrees with everything they say. If we created a list of what neoliberals believe, capitalism, free trade, international, forever wars, and then we compare that to JJ's, check, 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 check. It's a useful term. It exists for a reason.
It's very obvious that the reason why people are creating things like, Reddit threads, are neoliberal, or why people are having Twitter handles where they're calling each other the biggest neoliberal shill and this kind of stuff, is that it's obviously a bit tongue-in-cheek, and it's obviously in part sort of playfully kind of poking fun at a term that very few people sincerely choose for themselves. It's a term that's been largely applied, I think, pejoratively, much more than it's ever been adopted.
We're back to pathologizing.
I have a question for JJ. Why do you think that neoliberalism happened? Like, let's just lay a foundation of like the previous economic model, the way that the advanced industrial economies were organized prior to like the 1970s or 80s. Yeah. Like, how would you describe that transition into neoliberalism? This is why I think that neoliberalism is not a useful term, because I think that it is now often used to encapsulate a broad range of different things that happened at different times, right? So it's like Tony Blair, if we're like looking at him, his, neoliberalism was, like I said before, a response to the perceived failures of a more dogmatic kind of socialist Labour Party government that was seen as being discredited in Great Britain. And then that led to Margaret Thatcher's rise. Margaret Thatcher did not self-identify as a neoliberal. She self-identified as a conservative, right? Someone who in her mind was explicitly trying to get back to like Victorian values, the Victorian way, before all of these nasty labor unions were sort of gumming things up and all the rest of that. She did not seem to like those, no.
No, she didn't, right? And obviously we can take or leave what she did, but she saw herself as a conservative, a right-wing Tory who wanted to sort of return back to a kind of like individualistic, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, kind of, consciously Victorian. Like when people said, it sounds like you're trying to get us back to Victorian values, she would sort of say yes, and what of it, She was very happy to do that. But then
Joshua?
I'm chewing my gum, actually. I will have one later though, thank you. What about
but then sort of like, so that's Margaret Thatcher, and then, Margaret Thatcher wins like 3 back-to-back majority governments. That causes the Labour Party to sort of think like, hey, we're clearly doing something wrong here. She's very popular. She's getting a lot of... No, Greg, put the drugs away. So she's very popular. She keeps winning elections. The Labour Party has to do some sort of self-examining of why they're not doing as good as they perhaps expected to. And then Tony Blair comes along and modernizes the Labour Party and changes some of its sort of prior... commitments.
I think Margaret Thatcher later said that Tony Blair was her greatest success.
Yes, absolutely, right? So you see, like, these things are like, they're a long sort of complex story. And if we were to talk about the US, we'd tell a similar story, but, distinctive, the rise of Reagan and what sort of led to that, and what sort of, obviously America didn't have like socialist governments the way that Great Britain did, but, there was a sort of perception of that the democratic governments of the past had sort of failed in some way, and that this provoked a kind of reckoning on the Democrat side.
What do you say when people claim that Thatcher broke the labor unions at the expense of the GDP of Great Britain? that she was so thoroughly ideological.
Yeah.
She wanted to break organized labor,
Yeah.
and that in the total GDP of the country, it was actually to the economic detriment.
Yeah.
That if she was just purely motivated by profits,
Yeah.
they would have retained some level of labor organization. Are you sympathetic to that, or would you disagree?
No, I mean, I'm
with
sure
those?
that's probably a fair criticism. Obviously, sort of Thatcher's government did yield a lot of economic hardship. Unemployment went way up and things like that. So, but I mean, like, again, like, politicians are doing what they perceive to be the rational thing in the context of their time, if they're at all sort of sensible politicians. And I think, again, like, we can take or leave Thatcher's conclusions, but I think that she made conclusions that made sense in the context of a country that, was racked by labor strikes and, was run by a lot of very ideological, quite militant union leaders who were, very committed to, a certain sort of political agenda. And what's
Enough about the past. Okay, let's
but
talk
see,
about the present.
but see, Greg, this is why
Boring.
This is why ultimately you have to know facts about
wrong.
history, right?
Let's talk about Javier Milei. Is he meaningfully an ideologue?
Oh boy. Oh boy.
Narco-capitalist wins in Argentina.
Yeah, I mean,
Is he meaningfully an ideologue? Because I look at him, he's dressing up as an ancap.
Yeah.
He's cutting the government services left and right. Seems pretty ancap to me.
well, I mean, he seems that way as an outsider. Now that he's actually the president of a country and is accountable for the decisions that he has to make, and he has to work with a Congress that's controlled by parties hostile to him.
That's just how that's the structure that he's existing in. But he's going as hard as he can to break that structure and cut as many services as possible. That's like if I'm an ANCAP, that's what I would do, right? So it's like, okay, if I'm an ANCAP in this structure which is liberal, then yeah, I have to fight against that liberal structure. That's the same thing I have with Trump. Like Trump's trying to do as much as he can to push things in a certain direction, but he's constrained by the status quo framework that prevents anything from happening.
The deep state.
The deep state. Exactly.
Yes.
What do you think about Javier Milei? Is he meaningfully an ideologue? Is he meaningfully an anarcho-capitalist? Is this an example of an internet ideology manifesting in real-world politics right now?
Anarcho-capitalism is a very real ideology. I don't think that Milei is a good avatar of that ideology. I think that some of his actions have been, deeply in conflict with that. And if one was truly an anarcho-capitalist, they would be dissolving the state as the first and only order of business once they were elected.
Would an anarcho, because it exists in a liberal framework, a status quo framework, you can't just come in and dissolve the state immediately, even if you wanted to, right? That's why nothing ever happens.
I mean, for me, even the libertarians and the anarcho-capitalists are kind of self-deluded, just neoliberals.
Right, okay.
That this is the fundamental antagonism. If you read A Brief History of Neoliberalism, is that there is a contradictory belief system within the neoliberal framework that pits markets and the state against each other, where you need the state to uphold the markets, because the core of this dispute is that markets do not actually allocate resources in society in a very efficient way. There are huge negative externalities of markets. They necessarily create deficits, and so I'm very skeptical of.
Okay.
I'm very skeptical of any of these things.
I want to go back to something that Brogan said, because I do think it's worth noting when we're talking about the president, right? Which is the idea that he is now kind of like on the talk show circuit. He's spending a lot of time in America, like giving speeches at like right-wing gatherings and sort of the Charlie Kirk kind of set, right?
With Elon Musk. Yeah.
And what this suggests to me is like it kind of gets back to what you're saying about like the difference between culture and ideology. It seems to me that for all of sort of his pretenses of being a great sort of ideologue, ultimately he is choosing to function and is sort of functioning best when he just kind of operates as a kind of like broadly right-wing culture war guy who just kind of like goes around and complains about woke mobs and feminists and socialists as a sort of like cultural kind of term to describe a kind of like broad sort of left-wing coalition that people that vote for him or people that want to hear a sort of self-proclaimed right-winger give a speech agree to hate.
He's also very inconsistent about applying anarcho-capitalist principles, right? Like he is, you would think, would be on the foreground of gay rights and trans rights and all this stuff, and he's like a total cultural conservative.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of incongruencies there.
Yeah, but that's what it takes to get elected. That's what it takes to actually be popular, because the electorate is not ideological. The electorate, like in Argentina or any other country, there is not like a critical mass of people who think of themselves as ANCAPs, who think that they want an ANCAP government. That doesn't make sense to your average person. They just think they want a government that's kind of broadly culturally aligned with their instinct of right and wrong.
Who was that nice young man that shot those protesters?
Which
he nice young man.
Yeah, but that nice young man, he became like a demagogue for the right. He was like 17. He had a gun. Rittenhouse, yeah. In Argentina, there's a Kyle Rittenhouse bar.
Oh, yeah?
It's a bar called like the Kyle Rittenhouse bar.
Well, I mean, Kyle Rittenhouse is also on the right-wing circuit these days.
Yeah, they sucked him right up.
He gives speeches, and he's...
So this is kind of a broader issue, and I want to get to this as well. Because like, you think if the far leftist votes Democrat, they are effectively just a Democrat Joe Bidenist.
I mean, I don't think
their ideology doesn't matter.
No, that's not exactly what I'm saying. I sort of more meant it in the other way. Like, if somebody is a purported far leftist and yet does nothing but sort of encourage the rise of Donald Trump or make excuses for Trump or sort of say Trump's not so bad, and then I would say that person is like meaningfully functioning as a Republican. And I think that, somebody like...
So you can't be a socialist or a left-wing person who's like a left-wing populist who believes that Trump will in some way be better for the working class. You're just a right-winger.
I think that, we have... I think in a democracy, you have to judge people based on sort of the outcomes that their political activism is agitating towards, right?
You mentioned before that the electorate is not ideological.
Yeah.
And I think maybe we can rephrase the question a little bit of, where does ideology matter? And it is perhaps not the electorate that needs to be ideological, but it is vanguard parties, it's leadership, it's think tanks, it's elite universities and institutions, things like this.
Yeah.
And I think we can see very clear ideological decisions being made in the last few years, right? There's a self-professed ideology. There's a way of carving out institutional privileges and resources. So yeah, maybe the ages of mass ideology that is a part of the 20th century, but in the current reality, it's very clearly that some of the leadership of these parties is indeed ideological.
I mean, I think it's fair to sort of say, that there obviously are groups of sort of thinky types who consider themselves ideologues, in academia, in think tanks, and in some activist groups. And I think it's fair, when you want to sort of slander an idea, to sort of say well, that was an idea dreamed up by this socialist think tank or this anarchist think tank or whatever. I don't know if anarchist think tanks exist, but or
polycule.
Yeah. Or
it's a drum circle.
Because you see this a lot, right? I mean, you see this, for example, here in Canada, there's a group called the Fraser Institute, right? And it's known for basically being a sort of libertarian sort of market solutions to everything kind of group, right? And so sometimes, when a government... for example, where I come from in British Columbia, sometimes when the government is making arguments in favor of increasing the amount of private schools, for instance, they'll cite numbers that come out of the Fraser Institute showing how private schools outperform public schools. And then sort of what folks on the left will say is well, you got those numbers from the right-wing Fraser Institute. It's just run by a bunch of libertarians. They just hate the government. And so, I think that's a fair criticism in a way. We should always be sort of skeptical where our ideas are coming from, what sort of priors are going into shaping public policy proposals. But I do think that, I agree with what you said, in terms of mass groups of people identifying with an ideological tradition, in the say that, sort of say German society between the wars, where people were reading socialist newspapers and sending their kids to socialist kindergarten and that kind of thing. I mean, that was never a big sort of part of life on this continent, except in sort of the fringe. But it's much less the case anywhere today. And I do think that to the extent that the true ideologues exist, I think they're sort of in these kind of more just kind of thought leader type of jobs of professional thinkers and academics and
Guys, this is the Horseshoe Theory podcast, okay? So one thing you turned me on to, TikTok's getting banned, all right? Mm-hmm. You'll notice, this is something you turned me on to, a horseshoe coalition forming. The far left,
right,
Democrats, and the far right Republicans both agree to ban TikTok because TikTok is propagating ideas that threaten the status.
It wasn't far left and far right. It was just the broad majority of both parties.
No. Far left and far right are against the ban.
Oh, against
the majority is for.
The center left and the center right were let's ban TikTok. Or the far left and the far right, TikTok propagates ideas that are beneficial to both of them, like being anti-Israel.
Wait, so why does the far left want TikTok?
The far left wants TikTok because it's propagating like Osama bin Laden was good.
Yeah.
But
They want their
hold on.
misinformation.
No. For context,
Yeah.
the reason why the Squad and Squad adjacent progressives want TikTok to remain in the available in the United States is because pro-Palestine to pro-Israel content is a 70-1 ratio. That's why they want it to be there. The reason why the far right wants TikTok to remain. Why do they want it to remain?
So
I think,
what's there?
I think because well, I mean, I don't think that's
Is it anti-Israel again? Is that there?
Well, it's actually it's more like you can get all kinds of subversive anti-vax.
Yeah, people
stuff.
want their misinformation,
yeah,
basically.
yeah,
But I mean,
okay.
I think Greg is kind of overstating this a bit. I think that I don't think that this is an issue that is really animating the far right all that much. When you look at like MAGA world, they're not sort of bemoaning the loss of TikTok because their sort of line has been that TikTok is Chinese propaganda, and their movement is very animated by
Well, it's also the Biden line now.
Yeah, so I think that maybe there's a little bit of, I mean, like I from what I've seen from some of like the MAGA Instagram or even like Fox News, the kind of spin has more just kind of been like, why is Biden doing this now? He could have done this, years ago, and this is a distraction from Hunter's trial or something, right? Like it's not that. I don't think the right wing is very ideologically committed to.
I think why horseshoe theory is an exciting idea is because it's like redrawing the battlegrounds a little bit. It's like, okay, you thought that these guys were against these guys, but actually there's more, because of ideology, areas for people to align on different issues, right?
Freedom of speech is a big one.
Yeah.
People who they may not vote in favor of the same thing, but they will vote against a piece of liberal legislation. You'll have right-wing and left-wing forces vote against a certain, like the TikTok ban, for example. And that alignment, any attempt to open the Overton window further, to introduce new ideological elements, benefit both the left and the right in this case.
So there are situations where the left and right get benefited.
But I think that the other thing, though, when we're talking about horseshoe theory, is that a lot of the time these people wind up favoring the same policies for the same reasons. They kind of talk themselves into the same position for two different reasons, and then as a result, that group, I find, just becomes the same political group. Like, it doesn't become a coalition of two distinct groups, it just congeals into a single group, which in my experience, and we talked about this a bit on your podcast when I was on, often just seems to become like the right wing kind of like.
Yeah. So JJ doesn't believe you can be economically left wing and socially conservative.
Well, I just think that because I think that like, so for example, when we look at like who are like the classic examples of like horseshoe theory in action, we would say people like, I don't know, like Glenn Greenwald or Russell Brand more recently, or I don't know, J.K. Rowling, or sort of people like this, right? And a lot of times they just wind up functioning as just conservatives or right wingers. They become embraced by the right. They become the cause célèbres of the right. They're sort of trotted out as like, oh, even like noted liberal or noted left winger or so and so thinks this, but they're basically functioning as people of the right at this point.
JJ is blind to the Nazgul.
That only happened though because there's such rigid ideology among the Democrats and the progressives that those people are conceived of as right wing, and that if they were part of the Democratic Party before this drift towards the third way, they wouldn't be considered conservatives, because I would say being culturally conservative and economically left is most people. Like that's just most people vote by their own economic their own economic self-interest is what guides them, and they're kind of just complacent within whatever culture they were raised, and so they don't even think of it as having values. They're like, oh yeah, more stuff is good, more material comfort is good.
I don't know if I totally agree with that. I think that was actually one of the flaws with the what's the matter with Kansas sort of thesis, which is the idea that like people are motivated by their economic interests and should be motivated by their economic interests. I do think people often just kind of have cultural dispositions on a lot of economic questions, and I think that people that are culturally conservative tend to have a culturally conservative disposition towards economic matters as well, which is to sort of say that like people should not get things for free. Like that is kind of like morally wrong on a deep sort of instinctive, culturally conservative kind of way. I think that the idea that there exists some sort of large cohort of people that are very like socially regressive on like, you know, LGBT rights and women's rights and these sorts of things, and, you know, hostile to immigration and all that, but then simultaneously are very pro welfare state and big government spending and, you know, all this kind of stuff. I just think that's a bit of a fallacy. I think that people are often kind of hypocritical and maybe a little bit incoherent. I think that like the kind of the hands off my social security kind of type, right?
I was gonna, yes.
Yeah. And like that's not because they're like deeply committed to like the principle of social security as an ideological matter. It's just because like that's an entitlement that they personally feel entitled to and they want, and it's coming to them, so they're in favor of it. But if the, you know, there was a bill before Congress that's like, let's expand food stamps, the attitude would probably be, greedy good for nothings, why don't they get a job, you know? So I think that sort of what you posit is something that a lot of people believe and want to believe, and I think particularly people on the left who are maybe a little bit sort of leery of the kind of the social justification of sort of the left, the kind of the wokeification of the left, right?
Yes.
So like it's attractive to a certain kind of moderate leftist to believe that they can tone down the wokeness, not change anything about their economic agenda, and then that is somehow the sort of the secret sauce to win, you know, big majorities.
I would mention that we have polling from a survey conducted by the Center for Working Class Politics that ranks far and away like 80% a majority of like what is the most important political issue. It is the economy. It is their material well-being. And there is a large portion, I might not have the most granular statistics present in my mind right now because this is a study from 2020. This is about 4 years ago, but there's a pretty sizable majority of people who are ambivalent about progressive cultural issues, but still do need that they need the material stuff. And so if we look at the drift of the Republican coalition that's emerging in the United States, there's a pretty, you know, what did you call it before, this kind of post-racial coalition, emerging from the Democratic Party, that even the supposed beneficiaries of the progressive ideology and the rhetoric coming from the Democrats they're losing ground with them. They're losing ground.
Where are you with this? Because, you know, you're like me. You're excited by ideology. Yeah. You've been getting to EAC. You invented the term post-woke, right?
Did I?
I think so. Yeah. Where are you with all of this?
I'm thinking about the effect. I keep thinking about the effect on the individual. Because ideology, like I like what you said about all that matters is how you behave. Like all that matters is the outcome. You can say whatever you are, but if you act differently, then you're not that thing. Yeah. And then on the internet, there is no output. There's no act on the internet, so you can be whatever you want, right? Yes. But then how does that? I'm thinking like, how does that affect the individual to the point of action, right? Like, take like Timothy McVeigh. Yeah. Was he just bound to do something, some other mass casualty act, even if he wasn't radicalized by the right wing?
We might need to choose someone who is more representative of like most of the electorate.
No, but I think that, well, like to take that sort of at its face, right? Like if we accept that there's like some people that are, for example, like sociopaths who are like, you know, psycho murderers who aspire to like mass murder, they'll probably find some rationale for doing that. If they kind of have a screw loose, they'll glom on to some conspiracy theory or another that will justify their sort of like innate homicidal sort of tendencies, right? I do believe that there are some people in this world that are just kind of sort of wrecked in that sort of way. In the same way that, like, you know, going back to what I was sort of saying before, like there's some ideologues or some men that sort of like lust for power in the 20th century who became horrible dictators, and they probably would have been dictators of the right or left or military dictators or communist dictators or whatever. They would have risen to the top of their society just because they were, you know...
Or a CEO.
Or yeah, maybe, because they were like psychos or sociopaths. They were men who aspired to power and control others and wanted to be at the top of the pyramid, and they would, you know, say whatever crazy garbage it took to get them there.
Right, so it's all just psychological hand-waving. So Aaron Bushnell lights himself on fire. It's not because he believes in anything, it's because he's a wacko.
Well, probably. I mean, I don't think that any ideology unto itself can make someone do something that insane. I don't think that like ideologies are like despair codes, for example. You know, Brogan made a video about despair codes a while ago. Like, I don't think that they're like these kind of like things that you get in your head and they just kind of like snap something and then make you become a crazy extremist. Yeah. Right. And that's why I sort of said at the beginning, right? I think that like the left-wingers or like the doctrinaire academic communists might have a point when they sort of say, well, Stalin wasn't a true communist or whatever. It's like Stalin was like a psychopathic monster who sort of rose to the top of a political system that happened to exist at the time in order to sort of play out his, his power fantasies and all the rest of it in the same way, Saddam Hussein did, or Hitler did, or Pol Pot did, or whoever. I don't think that the ideology was what made them wicked.
Well, because I feel like that's how the average, that's how the layman interfaces with ideology, is that they see something bad happen, and that's when most people think about the far right or the far left, right? They see something bad happens in the news, or like there's the Unite the Right rally, or there's that kid who shot up the black church, right? And that's when those ideas pop into their head, is like these ideologies poisoned this person and made them act, right? It's even like Sam Harris has the argument that like the issue with Islamic extremists is Islam. It's not extremists. It's like the actual ideology is what makes them do that. Yes. And they wouldn't have done it otherwise.
Yeah, and
I feel like, are you separate on that? Like, do you think that it is the ideology, or do you think that it's not? It's more likely just they're like they just have the aesthetics of the ideology.
Yeah,
they would have done it anyway.
Let's take on radical Islam.
not radical Islam, but
just radicalism in general, and
sure.
Especially violent extremism. I think.
And you've talked to a lot of radicals.
Yeah, I would say I probably have an opinion that most people don't expect on this particular subject, which is I'm not of the Sam Harris camp, but to give a brief history of this field, there was a giant professional industry that opened up after 2016, and especially after the Unite the Right rally, about predicting white nationalist violent acts of terror. And a lot of that scholarly research was actually scaffolded on top of, if you look at the citations for those documents, the type of graphs that they use, the type of predictive models that they use, and the classification system even, it's actually from an earlier industry that opened up after the global war on terror, predicting jihadi extremism. So I am of the opinion, and I will say consistently, that ideology does matter, and that it will move people to act, right? So in this particular instance, we're talking about violent extremist, mostly lone wolf acts. Ideology does indeed play a role. What we were talking about earlier, to draw a very clear distinction, is that we were talking about how ideology would affect mass politics in the scale of like hundreds of millions of people, right? So these are very different conversations.
Yeah.
Ideology is extremely potent, clearly potent among elites, think tanks, etc., among individuals. Yes. Mass politics is a separate conversation, but I would say that counter to many people on the left, I am happy to concede that a portion of violent jihadi terror is actually a product of the ideology, as is white nationalist terror. And that you can't argue for both of those things, because it's fields of research that are scaffolded on top of one another. If you want to have one, you also have to have the other.
That's fine. I didn't know that. Was fascinating.
But for example, like, the famous book on sort of radical movements, Eric Hoffer's The True Believer, right? He sort of reached a similar conclusion, but like the way that he reached that conclusion, sort of, which was to say that whether somebody is a radical communist, a radical fascist, whatever, like that, what matters more is that we sort of look at the type of person who is drawn to that sort of identity. And he would sort of say that there was a kind of like frustrated, sort of like middle class young man of sort of unfulfilled ambition, a lack of meaning in his life, a sort of lack of purpose, a sense of powerless, but not like extreme poverty, not extreme disempowerment, a sort of envious kind of lust for a sense of more meaning that he feels entitled to, that he feels like some sort of elite structure is denying him.
JJ's right. Now we're cranking out those people.
So this is it though. That you're isolating their downward mobility.
Yes,
right?
downward
like
mobility.
Fascism is the ideology. It's the middle class run amok, right? It's these men who do not have the option to organize in their workplace because the labor unions have been broken. Their downward mobility is filled by this radical ideology.
I want to change the battleground. Are things working out for most people right now? Is life good? Is the world good? Is the world a good place?
Yeah, I think it's better than people give it credit for. Absolutely. I don't think that we're living in like the darkest time that's ever existed.
Do you think people have good upward mobility right now?
I think it's a complicated question. I think it's hard to generalize like on behalf of everybody in the entire world. I think that there are still a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of challenges. We live in a different economic time. We live in a time of, considerable economic change where, industries are falling and new industries are rising. But I do think that like when you look at a lot of the sort of the big picture statistics, there are still like reasonably good. I don't think that they're like all heading down. I think that some are going down, some are basically staying the same. There are some metrics that say that sort of like the younger generation is basically in the same position as their parents were at this age. Okay. There are some that say that maybe we're doing a little bit, or your generation is doing a little bit worse. But I don't think that you can sort of make a sweeping generalization the way that some people on the internet do, that like everything is bad and that everything is going down and that every sort of metric that matters is as terrible as it's ever been.
Okay. So Gen Z and Gen Alpha are doing pretty much the same, or a little, maybe just a little bit worse. Does that sound right?
I mean, no, it's like I know wages have stagnated just for inflation. Like if I don't know if I can't find the chart. I can't like cite the charts off the top of my head, but there's a lot that like if you just continued the growth of wages up until 1970s, like it's always the year 1970. A lot of things shifted. I believe that's one of the main theories is like that's fiat currency.
Don't say fiat currency. That's like
that's a dog whistle.
That's like a weird crypto.
The decoupling of the dollar from gold.
JJ thinks Bitcoin's a scam.
In 1970, the decoupling of the dollar from gold.
Crypto.
Yeah, anytime that somebody is positing anything involving gold as the big turning point, like that to me suggests that
there's a lot of things that shift.
There are other things that started to happen in the mid-1970s. 73 and 74, people isolate, which is also when they began to start offshoring manufacturing from the United States.
Yeah.
Do any of us own a house? No, eh?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you divide 0 by 2, you still get 0. So if Gen Z has 0% of the wealth and Gen Alpha has 0% of the wealth, like, oh yeah, they're not doing much worse because they had nothing to begin with.
That's not what he's saying. He's saying like compared to millennials or boomers or something, we're not that much worse off.
I mean, the statistics that I've seen, and this is infinitely niche and granular, but like it does seem very clear that there's a huge cluster of particularly home ownership in the United States that is concentrated around the boomer generation, and then trails off with the increasingly long tail for Gen X and so on.
Dastardly boomers.
But generational analysis is insufficient, because if you look at the total amount of wealth that is hoarded by the boomers, it is like nothing compared to the Bezoses and the Trumps and so on, and the Rockefellers and all of these people.
So wealth inequality is getting...
So generational warfare is going to be insufficient. You have to engage in class warfare to some degree.
We have to engage in class warfare. What do you think about that? You down to engage in class warfare?
I'm against it.
Against class warfare?
Yes.
I'll do class warfare.
We've been experiencing class warfare for quite a while. We've just been on the receiving end of it.
Ooh, there's the right.
No?
One might say that refusing to engage in class warfare is itself a form of class warfare, my friend.
Right, that's the hypocrisy of the status quo. Enough about the present. Let's talk about the future. Give me a positive vision of the future. What do you think? Well, what do you think the future is going to be like, just in general?
I think it'll probably be a lot like it is now. I think that people will live more or less the same way that they're living now. There'll be sort of new opportunities. I hope that this country gets its act together. I think that Canada Canada is not the same as the US, and actually the Canadian and the US economies have been deviating in a much more dramatic way than they previously have. There was a sort of chart that was going viral on social media. A lot of people were sort of sharing it, where, it shows sort of GDP growth per capita in both Canada and the US for most of the 20th century and the early 21st century, operating in perfect sync. But recently there's been a big deviation, whereas the US line is going up and the Canadian line is going down. So there's this big gap between the two countries for the first time. And I do think that there's a lot of sort of fundamentals with the Canadian economy that are very worrying in a way that they're not worrying in the US to nearly the same degree.
What's the source of the divergence of those economies?
There's a lot of, different factors. I think that there's a fundamental competitiveness gap in this country relative to the U.S.
We all work for the government and don't do anything.
I think that's a big problem. I think the degree to which a lot of sort of the post-COVID job growth in Canada has been overwhelmingly public sector driven, I think is very troubling. Obviously, I can give sort of tendentious sort of like right-wing talking points about, over-regulation during the Trudeau government sort of standing in the way of the growth in our traditional industries. That has probably played a factor as well. But then I think there's just always a kind of dynamism in the U.S. that is never worth being entirely bearish on, even when it's quite remarkable, like how we just sort of take it for granted, whether we're talking about AI or any other sort of like dramatic, sort of potentially world-changing technology. It's all concentrated in the U.S. It always is.
Yes.
It's always being
Yes.
run by U.S. firms, U.S. Entrepreneurs, U.S. businessmen. And, Canada's usually in a good position to sort of benefit from sort of the overflow effects of that. But for the first time, it seems like we might not be, because Canada is choosing to kind of like, put a heavy, rock around its legs at a time when the U.S. economy is.
So yeah, America will essentially remain number one. Also,
Yeah.
sure, we're going to remain a monopolar world. America's the top thing. All right, you go.
I think just one step before that, that's an interesting point I want to drive home for the audience, is that we've talked about the cost of living crisis, right? And like especially that seems to be hit a lot in the U.S. I know there was a study recently that was like millennials' biggest concern was housing costs, like a recent poll, and then
Yes.
in Canada it's exacerbated like tenfold,
Yeah.
right? Like there is no, at least in the U.S. I know it's still like it's not the best, but like you can go to like West Virginia and you can still find $80,000, $100,000, $120,000 homes.
Right.
You can find them in the South. There's no option in Canada.
Well, and the other thing too, though, is like when I'm talking about like economic growth and stuff in the U.S., it's not good just because it makes the line go up on the chart. Economic growth, the rise of new industries and competition and all that is also good because, in theory, this will create high-paying jobs, right?
Yeah.
Like if there's economic growth, if there's new industries, there's more jobs being created, there's potentially more high-paying jobs created. And so this has always been the fundamental sort of problem with U.S. v. Canada comparisons, is that the U.S. just has more high-paying jobs. There is greater wealth inequality in the U.S. than there is in Canada. But if more people have better-paying jobs, if your base level of income in Canada, or if your base level of income in the U.S. is consistently higher than it is in Canada, then the affordability crisis is more manageable in the U.S. than it is in Canada, where there's a much larger gap between incomes and cost of living than there is in the U.S.
I was watching an interview with a guy who left Toronto to go to Manhattan, and he was I think he was in finance, and he was saying that all of the promotions that would have taken him 2 or 3 years to get, and all of his colleagues 2 to 3 years to get in Toronto, he was seeing them happen in 6 months.
Yeah, that is a very remarkable thing. I've heard a lot of Canadians who've moved to the U.S. say that, is that until you're in the U.S., you don't like realize what a true kind of like promotion-based sort of meritocratic culture is really like that in the US, Canadians are often astonished just how much more competence gets rewarded in the US. And again, this is like a Canadian perspective, right? Like you from the US, you sort of take it for granted that, the way things are is the way that things are. But America does have certain competitive advantage in terms of its economic culture and the way that its economy is structured and the way that sort of American business culture works and all of that. And it's one reason why I think it's worth being consistently bullish on the US, hardships notwithstanding.
To respond to the initial prompt for
Canada got
this,
smogged again. We all know it.
I might characterize the near future as being somewhat different, where I think there's an incredible amount of volatility in the American system, and I've heard it described as America is both a first and a third world country, where there are some areas.
It's like a poor person with like a Gucci belt,
No, meaning that different zones, different zip codes in different states are in very different economic circumstances. So my expectation of the 21st century is massive climate disruption, significant events of extreme weather, climate refugees, economic stagnation, which we haven't really addressed, although I think we would both agree that there's economic stagnation, which is a result of the a lack of technological innovation in the last few years. But in the Marxist sense, this is something that is the phenomena described as declining rates of profit. I think that there are fundamental ceilings to market economies and levels of industrialization. So I'm very much a skeptic for the 21st century.
Will America remain number one, top dog?
It depends how far out you bring the timelines. We are definitely going to live in a multipolar world. The rise of the BRICS nations is very significant. I would look at China as being a significant geopolitical competitor. We can talk about the guidance fund, and we can talk about investment timelines for making massive infrastructural projects, and basically the ability of the capitalist class within either of these nations to wield political influence that is significantly reduced in China because of their economic model.
I'm investing
and so
in BRICS coin.
I think the American century is over. That's how I would put
American
it.
century is over. No. America's not the top guy anymore. What do you think about that?
For now, but in 2050, is that the case?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that the would-be American competitors all have very, very sort of significant flaws with their economic and political models that should not be understated. I mean, we'll see. Like, I do think that the biggest problem with America fundamentally is its own sort of political model and its own sort of political culture, and the culture of pessimism and the culture of self-doubt and the willingness to sort of resort to kind of like, extremist demagogic politicians like Trump to in part because they sell a vision of doom that is just not accurate. And so as a result, Americans and the American sort of political system is wasting a lot of time sort of fighting imaginary battles rather than kind of, unifying and dealing with the actual policy problems.
Like culture war stuff? Is that
like culture war stuff, or just like Trump wailing on about the stolen election and so every state government has to pass like election security laws or and also the like culture war bullshit, like, we can't rest until we ensure that only biological women are on the high school volleyball team or whatever. Like
number one priority,
right? Like it's all dumb, and that is a big sort of distraction that is, I think, hurting America. But every other country, like the would-be competitors, like the Indian sort of political system is not one to bet on. The Chinese political system has huge problems with what they're caring about. Like, is it really, the Chinese government is preparing for war with Taiwan? Is that economically rational? Is that going to yield a positive future for them? Right? Like like you talked about BRICS, like Indian Indian and Chinese like soldiers are like shooting at each other. Like it's, people can sell America short. I do think the problems are real. I think economic stagnation is, I think, a real thing. I was just doing a video the other day where, you look at GDP growth in the 80s and 90s, Clinton and Reagan numbers. You kind of like look at how stagnant things have been since then. That's a real problem. Like, it would be nice to get back up to, 4% economic growth the way that there was, when we were young. But is that possible? I don't know, right? Like, is it possible to go back? Or has like some of the fundamentals of the economy changed in such a way that we have to make peace with sort of perpetually stagnant growth? Like, have we kind of maxed out on the kind of the low-hanging fruit? I don't know. These are significant questions to ask, but I guess all that I would say is that I think that if there is a country that I have the most confidence is poised to answer these questions, competently, it would be the U.S. and not one of the competitor nations.
As a selfish American
Yes.
with allegiance to my country, I would agree with this actually, but I would say that's because the American model is going to adopt the competitive characteristics of the Chinese economy.
Oh, it's true. We're already becoming neo-China from the future.
That is, I had a friend put it in such a way that like post-pandemic lockdowns, there are going to be a series of shocks to the American model that will incrementally move it over to resemble something more like China.
We're Chinifying.
And we see the emergence of these everything apps. We see increasing state investment, a strong hand in guiding industrial policies.
We're
Some
all
people are
China
calling
now.
it the industrial policy renaissance. All of these things are very interesting, and they are uncharacteristic of Joe Biden's very neoliberal, sorry to use the phrase, but neoliberal record leading up until now. And so would we potentially see within the timeline of 2050 something like an American guidance fund, where American billionaires, a certain percentage of their wealth is actually held by the state and invested with timelines of half a century for infrastructure projects that they may not yield profitability for 5 years, 10 years. It could be 50 years from now until we see actually the profits of those high-speed rails and so on.
Do you know how much of Elon Musk's wealth is rebates from selling electric cars? Isn't it like 80% of his wealth is from the government? Because he gets
rebates.
Yeah, I think
Corporatocracy.
Yeah, it's some huge amount like that. He's basically a billionaire because of
the state and private enterprise working in tandem to make quadrillionaires.
One could say that 100% of his wealth exists with the permission of the government.
For now, until he gets more money from the government.
Until the government decides to take it.
Stan.
Right. His own sovereign. Yeah.
It's interesting what you said about the U.S. being like a first world and a third world country. Because I was thinking about that when we were talking about the housing thing, where it's like St. Louis and Memphis have like the highest murder rates. If you look at like murder rates by city, it's like St. Louis, Memphis, and then like Honduras or like Honduran cities and Mexican cities. It's baffling. And then also in the same country as, New York or like Manhattan or Portland, right? That's insane.
Well, it's a huge country. It's like 333 million people. Like, it's the third biggest country in the whole world, right?
I mean, but in Canada, you can't find, like, for all the issues with Canada, it's better to be poor in Canada. Like, you can't, there's nowhere you can go in Canada and find something as different as Manhattan to Memphis.
Yeah, I mean, but again, like, I think that's a reflection of just how large and vast and diverse the U.S. is relative to this country. You know, like, we barely have more people than California. Like, it's a much smaller, but, you know, like, I hear your point, right? You know, if it's better to be poor in Canada, perhaps that might mean that basically, like, if you're poor in Canada, say if you're like lower middle class, you can sort of take for granted that lower middle class stability in a way that an American might be at a higher risk of descending even further down the line.
Yeah,
but in Canada, I think there's very less opportunity that the lower middle class person will climb the ladder. Like, I think that door is much more closed to him. That's sort of like that's like America's greatest strength and flaw is the economic mobility in both directions, is that you make that trade-off, is that you have a society where it's easier to, you know, there's more potential to sort of rise very high, which we were talking about earlier. You know, you go to America, Canadians are astonished at how meritocratic it is, how you'll get promoted for your competence and all the rest of it. But the dark side of that is that if you don't sort of meet the standards, then yeah, you can be punished and, you know, people will be relatively unsympathetic for your plight.
So Canada's the land of midwits.
Kind of. So, I mean, Harper once said that, you know, it's a sort of a mediocre country with a lot to be mediocre about or something. Yeah.
I think we all agree with that.
Yeah.
I think what's being missed here is Brogan moving going on Google Maps and moving the little guy and like looking at these cities and looking at their murder rates.
Yeah, I love doing that.
That's just your hobby part time.
It's my hobby. I looking at like St. Louis and a street view, just like, fuck, dude, this is like Iraq. It's fucking insane.
I might give maybe a counterpoint. I don't know if this is or at least an addendum to this idea of meritocracy as something that drives innovation. I'm certainly someone who has been in many cases excluded from institutional resources in universities and the art world, and I do all of my stuff through Patreon and Substack, and I'm independent, right? So I certainly I'll be the first person to concede that type of, you know, steep market incentive drove me to innovate all sorts of weird forms in the artworks I was doing before. But there's another side of this where if you look at some of the social democratic countries in the Nordics, if you look just sheerly by the size of the population and the number of patents that they file, there's something to be said about having a social safety net as an impetus for people to create small businesses and to take risks. Yeah. So I like to think that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. I really think there are brilliant, talented people in all corners of the world, and they may not have access to resources. And then what you observe in some of these social democratic countries, which have been going through their own process of neoliberalization, which we can talk about in the EU and hard money and all of these other theories, but there is something about the penalties of dropping out of the labor market and your small business failing. If those penalties are not so rough, well, why not try? Why not start the bakery? Why not start your tech company? Why not start do your startup activity, which is a big risk? And, okay, if it fails 2 years later, you can coast on unemployment for a little bit. You can find another job. Whereas in the U.S., it's like, oh, you're homeless. You're done. Yeah, it's over.
And one way we could provide the social safety net is with universal basic income.
No.
So
okay, so that's
I'm going to start printing money over here.
Okay, so that's okay. That's obviously dumb.
Make that $1 trillion coin.
Yeah.
Referencing his famed song, "Print Money."
yes. So that's obviously stupid. But I am sympathetic to what you're saying, Joshua. Like I do think, and I mean, like, this is sort of like how sort of squishy I am on a lot of these kinds of things. I do think that, for example, if there was a public option for health insurance in the U.S., that would probably be a strategic advantage for the U.S. That would probably help America sort of
hell yeah.
That's No, it's like I think that I think that America would never want to have, say, the Canadian model where you have a public sector monopoly for all essential sort of medical services. But I do think that, like, I'm sympathetic to what you said. It's like, when we look at the Nordic states, sort of the cause célèbre of a lot of sort of socialists and sort of left-wing Americans over the years, their model of social democratic society is not a society where you just sort of sit on your ass and you just get handouts from the government all day, right? It's a society that has a very strong capitalist wealth generating economy in which there's a lot of like large corporations like IKEA or Saab or Nokia or whatever that are generating lots of jobs, lots of wealth, products that can be shipped all over the world. It has a strong capitalist economy, but it also has a safety net that functions in the purest sense of the word. It catches people who are not able to sort of function, perhaps in the short term in that sort of competitive market driven economic system. So I do think that like it seems self-evident that if America had a sort of like more robust safety net, that could probably help sort of alleviate some of the apprehension to the kind of like risk-taking entrepreneurship that we need to see to get the American economy to be sort of thriving in the 21st century. The problem is that again, and this goes back to sort of like the degree to which a lot of these debates are cultural more than ideological or more than sort of principled in any sort of way, is that there's obviously like a lot of Republicans who just do not want to entertain that idea, no matter how much you can dress it up in sort of the language of it being economically rational from a sort of pro-entrepreneurial, pro-capitalist perspective.
They vote for it if it was based UBI.
They wouldn't.
If it was the based one?
Based UBI.
There's no way.
Use this based UBI to buy your MAGA hat.
$2,000 a month gym membership credit.
I like that.
Yeah, you get $2,000 a month to go to the gym.
And we could do it. We just have to print money. What do you think about UBI?
I'll answer that in 1 second because I just want to like tie a bow of absurdity on this whole topic. Is that if you read Fukuyama's original End of History, the thing he posits as the final form of human government. For him, liberal democracy was Denmark. He names Denmark explicitly, and the great irony of this Sanders campaign in the U.S. is that he wanted the U.S. to be more like Denmark. And this is a radical insurgent campaign who's described as a socialist, who is essentially advocating for the great ideological victory of liberal democracy at the end of history. So the absurdities of the conversations we're having, just to frame this in the grand ideological terms of the 20th century, the socialism today is just actually existing capitalism in Denmark.
But
like, it's very impoverished.
But the thing that's significant is that, and we've talked about this as well, like there obviously is a strain on the U.S. left, on sort of like the self-identified socialist left, that is not interested in sort of focusing on the fact that the Nordic countries have a strong sort of capitalist part of their economy that has, a large sort of free market employment-based system.
They're also focused on the fact that it's racially homogenous. That's interesting.
That doesn't invalidate the idea.
Nazbol ethno-state.
It is because specifically the Nordic countries were late in the industrialization of Europe, such that there were already well-organized trade unionist movements throughout the rest of the continent that had early factories where labor was not organized. And so when industry began to move to countries like Sweden, there were socialist and communist groups pre-existing the factories being built in that country. That's why the Nordics, and particularly Sweden, was very effective in their workplace organization. Additionally, I mean, we can sometimes attribute all of this to like the generosity of social democracy and, they're willing to spend on the welfare state and all of these things. But if you look at some of these countries, they actually have large amounts of people who are employed in the private sector, but they have sectoral bargaining where all of the unions in a specific field, particularly auto manufacturing, will negotiate in concert with one another. They're just very good at organizing because they've had basically they have an early adopter benefit. To put this in platform terms, they have an early adopter benefit that they were organized in advance of industry coming to their countries. It has nothing to do with being racially homogenous. It is just historical development. That's a very important point that people on the far right like to conflate, that, because these countries don't have immigrants or whatever, all of that is nonsense. These are people who are making arguments because they don't understand the history of industrial development.
Racially homogenous.
But then the other thing that I was wanted to get at as well is just that, I think that too often we think, or at least certain people on sort of the far left in America think, that socialism means I get everything for free, right? Like I get free healthcare, I get free education, I don't have to pay taxes because the taxes are all paid by the evil rich people.
That is how Marx defines socialism.
And we right?
That's volume 3. Most people don't get that.
You get as much as you like of whatever you want, right? And see, but I think that understanding of socialism has been, I'm not a socialist, obviously, but I think that particular definition of even democratic socialism has been very sort of deleterious, because it takes the work part out of the sort of the socialist understanding, right? Like, it takes the work, the workers of the world, all of this kind of rhetoric, right? The idea of a sort of redistributionist society being worker centric still requires that people be workers and people be contributing to sort of the overall economy, so that there actually is wealth to be redistributed, right? Through taxation and
until we got the robots.
The robots will fix that.
How will they fix that? Wouldn't they be a threat to it, if anything?
They'll make all the stuff and they'll give it to us for free.
Oh, is that so?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fully automated utopia. The robots do all the work, and we just take a little drop of that techno capital and we print some money.
Where does the techno capital come from?
The robots.
How would the robots generate wealth?
The robots already generate wealth.
Well, how?
The guys who own the robots have all the money.
Yeah, but somebody still has to make the robots and run the robot factory. And
State.
The state does that?
Yeah.
And where does the state get the money from?
They get it from the big tech corporations that they take 10% of
But
Elon Musk's money.
I thought the state is running the tech companies.
Yeah, well, the state works in tandem. This is what already happens. They work in tandem with these big corporations. And I don't know.
Donald Trump personally pays for every feminist dance theory degree in the United States. That is the policy position. We'll be very clear about that.
Yes. That's true MAGA communism.
There you go.
Yes.
Right.
Unless do you have anything to say before we move on?
No.
Okay. Because my this is a good lateral move to just technology in general. Is the internet overrated?
Probably a little bit. I think that, I did a video today, in fact, I posted, where I was sort of talking about sort of my theory of kind of the post-war era as this very formative, important time in sort of the development of our modern world. And, I tend to define the post-war era, what the Japanese call the Showa times. I'm trying to popularize the name of the Great 30, which is a term that the French use, sort of 1945 to, the late 80s, early 90s-ish time. Sort of the technology that was introduced in that time, that was when sort of the personal computer was first introduced. Computers as we know them today were first introduced, obviously sort of modern television broadcasts, sort of the modern the modern sort of industrial factories making things out of stuff like plastic and all these sort of synthetic materials that we use today. That was a truly revolutionary time, technology-wise. And then sort of in the 19th century, sort of the late 19th century, sort of Victorian times, let's say the 1860s or 70s to the dawn of the 20th century, when we had steam engines and sort of the first motor cars and sort of stuff like that. And the first sort of industrial assembly lines and all that. That was a truly sort of revolutionary time technologically. And I think that the internet cannot hold a candle to any of that stuff. The internet at best introduced, considerable gains in efficiency, but efficiency in realms of technology that we already had, broadly satisfactory means. So the internet made person-to-person communication more efficient. But, we could already talk on the phone, we could write letters, we could even send faxes. This kind of stuff existed. It's more efficient now, but not efficient in a way that has yielded dramatic certainly productivity gains. And, the economist Paul Krugman for the New York Times, got a lot of flack because he's a big proponent of the argument that the internet is overrated. And he always cites economic data. He says, when you look at sort of the great periods of economic growth and economic development, again, it broadly conforms to what I'm saying. You see big spikes in productivity and economic growth in sort of the late Victorian era, and then you see it in the post-war era, but you don't see any comparable spikes in sort of the internet era, which suggests that it was sort of broadly overrated.
And all of our lives have been completely dominated by the internet for the last 20 years, because we're all YouTubers and we're doing this for the internet right now. Okay, you go.
Culture. Well, I'd say culture, and I think you might agree with this. Culture on the internet is vastly more interesting than it was before. Would we be?
Well, what do you mean by that? Culture on the internet is vastly more interesting than what? Than pre-internet?
The number of consumer preferences and weird niche stuff that you can get into, and the genres that were available pre-internet. There's just such more specified tastes in music and different forms of culture. I would say that those things are more interesting, but the economic question primarily what technology has done in the last few years, people draw a distinction between the world of atoms and the world of bits, right? That we've had a technological, an environment of technological stagnation for material innovations like steam engines and Concorde jets and this type of thing. And then most of our innovation has been in the field of software and nano trading bots and things like this. And so all of those financial innovations that are running arbitrage and are making trades based off of Trump's tweets where he says Diet Coke and then the bots buy Diet Coke that day. I am of the Marxist tradition where the stock market is savings. The stock market is not profit. That's where you put your money in the market, you withdraw to live off of later. And so when we index those things like line go up as being indicative of profitability, we're actually making a category error. So I don't think that the type of technology we've produced in the last few years, the type of like Silicon Valley software innovation, new platforms and so on, that has not really contributed in a positive economic sense.
So when you say, so you're saying that the line can go up, but it's not good?
Sometimes line go up does not mean more money.
But even like, I think, though, to what you were sort of saying in a cultural way, I mean, I think some of it is just we're just exposed to some of like the wackier stuff now. Like maybe it's more accessible, which again kind of gets to the efficiency argument. But I think like even say like the kind of stuff that you're interested in, right? Like there's always been crackpots, for instance. Like there's if we're taking us like, you know, are there more like wackos in the world?
Are
now,
there
thanks
more
to the internet? It's like, I mean, like maybe the wackos have improved their efficiency of communication with each other. Maybe it's a bit easier for them to get organized. But even then, like one thing that often astonishes me, like for example, when we're talking about red pill or Bitcoin or whatever, like how much of these arguments are just old arguments. They're just reheated arguments that were very present in like the late 20th century.
Nothing ever happens.
They're just conspiracy theories that have been around forever. They're just getting like reheated and reserved up to a new generation. And if the internet didn't exist, they'd probably be radicalizing themselves through the way that they did in the old days, you know, through direct mailers and self-published books at the independent bookstore and, you know, subscriptions to newsletters. And
I think we need to now talk about the Trotskyite to neocon pipeline, if we're going to get into this. So we're going to back up a little bit.
I'm unfamiliar with this pipeline.
Okay. So no, we've talked about it before. You haven't heard me like shitpost and refer to it in that silly type of way. But if you roll back the clock to the 1920s in City College University in New York, there's a school lobby of Alcove 1 and Alcove 2 where the pro-Stalinist left in that period, 1920s, is gathering in Alcove 1. The anti-Stalinist left, the Trotskyites, in Alcove 2. These people are critical of the Soviet Union. They believe in a left-wing project. There's a fantastic documentary called Arguing the World that follows a group of people, Daniel Bell, Irving Howe, who's a co-founder of the Democratic Socialists of America, Irving Kristol, who is most important for this story, and Nathan Glazier. So what happens over the course of the 20th century is that these people, they criticize Stalin in the beginning, and they're given a reason to believe in liberal democracy. So what they experienced from the 1920s to the 1980s was this unprecedented upward mobility, where they grew up in tenement buildings where they would have a family of 12 people crammed into 2 rooms and bunk beds and all of this stuff. And then, you know, their sister owns a home, and they have cars, and they have a yard, and they're living a life that their parents could never dream of as these poor immigrants working in factories on assembly lines. And, you know, that in assistance with, we should mention, a little bit of help and funding from the CIA, they incrementally drift over those 60 years to believing in the liberal project. To the extent where
stinky trots.
this is where the Trotskyite to neocon pipeline comes in that Irving Kristol in the 1980s is an advisor to the Reagan administration. So they part with their previous socialist ideology and they join the liberal project. In fact, they become its thought leaders. They become its proponents. But what convinced them to do that, aside from the CIA funding and all of that, was that liberal democracy offered a reason to believe in it. There was a reason to believe in liberal democracy because of that upward mobility. But today we are in a position of stagnation, possible decline, potentially serious decline in the next few years. And so is there a reason to believe in liberal democracy? I say no. I think ideology will come back.
Smelly, stinky trots became neolibs. Tales all this time. I think that kind of reminds me of kind of your points where it's like they would, like, if you just get wrapped up into the status quo framework of like the right, then you're just like effectively like, you know, you're a right winger. Even if you're ideologically a Trotskyist.
Yeah, and it's like Irving Kristol we now think of as like basically a right winger more than anything else. You know, and carrying on his legacy, Bill Kristol, who's although Bill Kristol's interesting because now he's kind of drifted from the right and is now a Democrat because he's one of these super never Trump Republicans, right? But no, it's like, and that's why like neoconservatism, like it became, he was sort of the term that people used before they started using neoliberal, right? I remember neoconservative being the big sort of scare term of the early 2000s.
But still a scare term among paleoconservatives.
Yeah. Well, I mean, often now it's just used to mean Jews, right? So it's, but no, it's like a lot of the neoconservatives, like whatever their sort of this kind of neoconservative, whatever their backstory was, yeah, by the end of it, they were just functioning as rather run-of-the-mill right-wingers, right? And a lot of them as well became associated particularly with a very sort of like hawkish anti-Soviet foreign policy, you know, sort of like the Reagan kind of like era, you know, fighting the Sandinistas and all of this kind of stuff. Like that was ultimately what they chose to prioritize. And then whatever sort of you know, belief systems that they had on economic matters or whatever kind of became subordinate to this just kind of, yeah, just a very sort of standard run-of-the-mill kind of like Republican Party agenda. So I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting. It's these sorts of things are interesting stories in terms of their genesis of sort of small subcultures that then I think often have a tendency to get sort of inflated as being representative of sort of much more kind of like broader trends in society than they probably actually were.
But the broad trend you're saying is the inverse is happening, because now capitalism ain't good for everybody anymore. And so we're going to see people who are just dispositionally, because they grew up in this neoliberal world, move towards more radical ideologies to find a solution to them.
Yeah, leaders of vanguard parties, experts, political organizers, people in institutions and think tanks.
Yes.
I would say that we're beginning to see the beginnings of that now, where the think tank class has moved a little bit away, especially post-pandemic, moved away from the kind of free market ideology of the consensus of the last few years. And so the question remains of whether a mass politics will again become ideological. I think it is then, I mean, I would say that it is the job of the leaders of those political organizations, the vanguard, to raise the class consciousness of most of the people in the society, to have a mass politics.
I think that the most seductive sort of alluring politics, unfortunately, like the equivalent of the sort of thing that seduced the Irving Kristols of the past, if there's a modern day sort of equivalent, I'm sorry to say, is it feels like a lot of it is this kind of like MAGA reactionary social conservatism. Like when we were talking before about like the horseshoe theory and all of that, like what does seem to be pulling some segment of sort of progressive-minded or ostensibly progressive-minded people to the right, it does sort of seem like it's like sort of like reactionary sort of social conservatism, being anti-trans, being anti-vaccines, you know, being, you know, just anti-BLM or whatever, right? Like this is the kind of stuff that seems to be signaling the sort of the movement. And I think that sometimes I think a lot of the left-wingers are hoping that there'll be this kind of like the reverse will happen, is that a lot of right-wingers are going to become sort of like more class conscious and more sort of economically progressive. And I just think that there's very few signs of that happening, and a lot of signs of like people that were at one time probably would have identified with a sort of progressive economic agenda instead becoming socially conservative. And in the same way that, you know, like the Irving Kristols of the world sort of like just became sort of like run-of-the-mill Republicans because ultimately all they cared about was a certain Reaganite foreign policy agenda. I think that a lot of these people are then becoming sort of like MAGA social conservatives and letting any other sort of part of their agenda fall by the wayside, because ultimately I think that politics is defined primarily by priorities more than ideology. So it's like, what do you choose to define as the most important issues sort of being adjudicated by the political process at any given time, and then you vote on that basis, you self-identify with a party on that basis.
And Trump could have locked in that coalition if he just got Bernie Sanders as his VP.
No.
the real horseshoe theory. Yeah. I mean, the only thing that I would add to that is that we can draw differentiation between the think tank class and the punditry class. There is overlap, but in many cases they are distinct, because the think tank people write to an expert audience, and the pundits interface with the media and the general listenership, viewership of the public. The pundits are especially predisposed to feeling the precarity of their class position and to argue on culture war fronts because people with resources, pundits need to pay their bills, right? They have a class position, and so they have to fall on donors. Similarly, if we look at the incentive structure for think tanks, they equally have donors, but there is a segment, I would argue, of, and I would agree that a lot of the Josh Hawley rhetoric and these kind of Marco Rubio types, and these people are kind of like blowing smoke. Are they really going to do any of this stuff? Josh Hawley votes for right to work. This pro-worker rhetoric we should be very skeptical about it. But there is a segment of the American capitalist class who are the owners of industry, the owners of manufacturing, and they would benefit, actually, we could say they would clearly benefit from reindustrialization, bringing jobs back, handsome subsidies on behalf of the U.S. government, steering industrial policy and economic environment that resembled something much more like those 30 years of like the post-war era. And so those people, the think tanks that draw their funding from them, well, they'll certainly get a pay raise if they make a very compelling policy that rewards their donors. So I almost have more faith in the think tank class than the punditry class because of basically who they're responsible to. But I would share a similar skepticism about all of this kind of like pro-worker rhetoric. I would refer people to an excellent article in Damage Magazine by Dustin Guastella, who is an organizer with the Teamsters in Philadelphia, that expresses severe criticisms, strong criticisms of the kind of Sohrab Ahmari compact magazine, conservative social democrats in the U.S.
What did they say in the piece?
He says that if you look at the history of the different constituencies within the Republican and Democratic Party, there is still an emaciated, impoverished labor movement that is attached to the Democratic Party infrastructure, attached to those institutions, whereas the Republican Party has zero. So if you are seriously looking to build, and keep in mind, this is someone who is very much a kind of class-centric leftist, really unsympathetic to culture war issues. He doesn't think there's a lot of hope in like the GOP worker vision.
Yeah, it's actually quite telling. I mean, I see this a lot on Trump's social media timeline, is that all of the endorsements that he's getting from unions are often like the police unions, right? Like it's sort of like these sectors of the private sector. Well, I guess they're not even private sector, but these sort of sectors of the labor movement that are all like culturally right-wing coded and function as sort of soldiers in sort of like right-wing culture wars, and those are the kind of like the groups that sort of Republican politicians are the most excited to get endorsements from, which I think kind of shows the degree to which, in practical terms, a kind of like worker-centric sort of like Republican agenda is still ultimately sort of subordinate to culture war considerations.
Do you both think that we're in an ideological vacuum right now then? Like you're saying it's being filled with reactionary politics, right wing, and then you're saying do you think it's reactionary or do you think it's more collectivist?
That's what communism.
An ideological vacuum?
Yeah. Like there is no
like that there's sort of like a space that's being filled by something that could be filled by something else.
No, like if people are turning away from the way like the status quo, the way things have worked for the past 40 years, and there's a hole to fill of like how do I make sense of the world?
I mean, there's a lot of people who are experiencing downward mobility, particularly younger people, and they go out onto the internet in search of answers. When they look at the mainstream media, they see narratives that are either incomplete or incoherent or are just, plainly untrue and are later disproven a few months later. And so there's people who are hungry in search of the answers. But if you put this in the grand ideological frame of the 20th century, the thing that is now called socialism and fascism is, vastly, vastly reduced of what those terms meant in the 20th century.
Yeah.
So there has been, depending on the time scale you look at this, 1980 to 2020, there's an expansion of the Overton window. 1920 to 2020, there's actually a shrinking of the Overton window.
Okay.
And I want to break the Overton window with a brick.
Split it apart.
And what comes out?
An asshole. But the centrists get knocked out of the Overton window because it breaks apart, and they were right in the middle. Now it's not.
What are centrists?
You.
And what am I?
You're between ideas.
Between ideas.
I mean, you're a good example of a centrist because you would vote for Pierre Poilievre in Canada, and you will.
Yeah.
But you would also vote for Joe Biden in America.
Yeah.
Because the right in America is too far right for you, basically.
Yeah, but it's not a matter of ideology. It's like sort of like, the right in America is run by this like lunatic Donald Trump.
Yeah. Centrists be like, it's not about ideology.
Well, I mean, it is. It's like Trump is worse than Pierre Poilievre, not because Trump is necessarily like more right wing than Poilievre per se.
He is.
He is to some degree, but he also like prioritizes different issues. That like it's harder to say
like nationalism.
Well, I mean, it's sort of like, well, what is our metric for
Culture war
for determining who is more right wing?
Who talks more about culture war issues, Trump or Pierre Poilievre?
Yeah, obviously Trump does.
Okay, so he's further to the right.
Yeah, I guess so. But I mean, like the bigger problem with Trump is that he has an agenda, and I don't know if this counts as a right wing agenda, but like Trump's agenda is to like consolidate power in himself, undermine the integrity of U.S. elections,
Yeah, authoritarian right winger.
Yeah, but I mean, like that doesn't reflect my vision of conservatism.
The blue political compass, funny color. We got him, boys.
But I mean, it is interesting to say because it's like, Trump has a great sort of degree of power to determine what it means to be a conservative, what it means to be on the right. And there is ways in which Pierre is obviously influenced by, that kind of traditional American ideological leadership position. And so it would be sort of like naive to suggest that there is no aspect of kind of like Trump-style politics present in the Conservative Party of Canada. I just still believe that leadership matters a lot. And even though I think that there's certainly probably like a lot of people in Pierre's inner circle or in the Conservative Party in general that are eager to see Trump succeed and want to cheer him on, ultimately, Pierre is a much more competent, sane, and I think reasonable guy than Trump is. And, if Pierre was running for president of America as the Republican leader, maybe I would think differently about the Republican Party than I do now.
Fair enough.
In the same way that I would think differently if the Republican leader was some other Republican candidate who wasn't completely MAGA brained, somebody like Larry Hogan from Maryland.
Who's a way more status quo person than Trump.
Yeah.
So you like the status quo, so you're centrist. We agree.
I thought I was a right winger.
You're like center right, you're conservative.
Yeah, but how's that center?
Centerist is just the box around the center.
Yeah, you're in the Overton window.
Yeah,
that's what we're saying. Whereas, we're more interested in people who are outside of the Overton window.
I know. To what degree do you think the internet has this? The internet really obscures what's actually happening because everything gets so exacerbated. I look at like it feels like there's more interest in individualism now than there was before. Like when I was growing up, especially in the last couple of years. Like if you look at like Andrew Tate as a phenomenon, right? Obviously, there's like some great branding there, but like the fact he is the most famous person in the world, or was for the last 2 years the most famous person in the world, means there is some sort of like an ideological vacuum that he's filling with like, okay, you have to get rich yourself. The world's a hard place. And you have to like master it. You have to topple it, and you have to do it alone. It's up to you. You have to
get 5 wives.
Get 5 wives. Get all these do these get rich quick schemes. Make social media content, and then people are following that. Like millions and millions and millions of young men are following that. I know, like personally, I don't know many men who are like not really rampant individualists who are like don't brag about working 80 hours a week or like don't go to the gym. Everyone I know has these like really soul agent aspects of them. Do you think that is that going to topple the potential for class war?
We talked a little bit about this in the previous episode of the podcast where like, yeah, there's a lot of people today who are like bootstrapping individualists. They're small business owners. They do every aspect of work. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the way that the neoliberal economy was built, it was designed in such a way to prevent the formation of organized labor such that everyone would be a small business owner and you would move all of the shop floors to the developing world where labor would be very cheap. The people would be too precariatized, too vulnerable to really meaningfully organize. And so there would not be a real threat to capital. And so, yeah, there's a lot of people who think that way of I'm individually responsible for this and I got to be a tough guy and I got to bootstrap. because that just was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
There was no other option. And if you thought like, oh yeah, well, everybody who does this field that is hyper individualized, they should also engage in collective bargaining. Like, that's just not possible for some jobs. It's not possible to organize your Slack chat. People have tried. I've talked to people who tried to do it. It is possible to organize your shop floor. And so one of the reasons, aside from the economic consensus, one of the reasons that shop floors were sent to the developing world is because those people have a lot harder time organizing because there's such an incredible asymmetry of their economy, where like you basically live in a favela or you get a middle class job. And so people are so precaritized, they don't want to lose those things. The labor market is just a lot more squishy. People are more vulnerable. So I almost want to say that people have thought of this like bootstrapping individualism as a rational response to the conditions created around them. What are those conditions? Those are neoliberalism that was done intentionally.
Yeah.
Work harder, get on the bands.
Right. Max.
I like how there should be a graph tying the potency of nicotine products to the economy. Just put those lines together. Because now we're into like 60 milligrams a day territory versus you
have to be. You gotta be to grind.
Cigarettes from 50 years ago or 70 years ago, which were like 1 milligram of nicotine. Or the potency of caffeine as well. Go from green tea to fucking 300 milligram Rain Monster Nitro energy drinks.
Drugs have been ramping up recently.
It's true. And that's been a bad thing.
Yes, but I think it's been a thing because we have to work harder and harder just to stay ahead.
I think it might just be because people like taking drugs.
No, I do like taking drugs.
I think that might be a factor as well. You have to figure that people like addicted substances that.
But don't you think it has something to do with the fact we got to focus all day, every day on building our business and grinding and hustling?
I think it's that people like the dopamine of taking drugs.
I do like the dopamine of taking drugs. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, and I think that as societies become more permissive and less judgmental to drug use, we might see a correlating uptick in that activity that is no longer as stigmatized as it once was.
What's your take on drugs?
Stimulants
I
specifically.
mean, we can't possibly be working harder than like the 12-year-olds in the coal mine in West Virginia 100 years ago.
Those slackers.
There's more mental work.
Yeah, that's stimulating.
Like,
That's flow state
I would
work.
kill the.
I have to look at a
That's the
computer.
flow state,
I have to look at a computer for 10 hours.
I wish I could mine coal instead of touching computer. You don't understand.
I feel so you'd get you're working out, your joints are moving around.
You got a community of children around you.
your lower back doesn't hurt. Yeah, I'll bartend for 14 hours and won't, strong steel manning here. But I do genuinely hate sitting in front of a fucking computer.
Yeah,
as much as I love writing and editing and like the joy of being releasing work, I want to kill myself when I sit in front of a computer.
Exactly.
When the day ends and I watch the sun go up and down and I haven't left the chair because I can't.
Mm-hmm. And our only economic way of getting out of this really is to make other people sit in front of the computer more.
Yeah, go get a Fiverr Indian to make you some thumbnails, do some snappy editing for you.
Bang, bang, bang.
Get a Filipino.
Use AI to automate it.
Yeah, and then you know what you do? You look at good screen instead.
Good screen, yes, good screen. That's my favorite kind of screen.
Video game.
Has AI done anything? Ever?
Has AI done anything?
Yeah.
I don't know. Not very many good things. I think it's done a lot of like sort of like mid things.
Yeah.
Everything that I've seen AI make so far has been pretty powerfully mid. I think that people have to sort of like really convince themselves. That people have to do a lot of work to convince themselves that something AI has made has been good.
Right.
And I think you see that in the way that everybody who makes defenses for AI does so in a very defensive way. Where people say like, well, it's not really good at this and this and this and this, but I sometimes use it for this and it's kind of good at that. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I'm pretty bearish on AI. I think that it will, I think it's like again, like it's like the internet or something. It's like a very sort of like, guy, can you stop doing drugs for like 3 friggin' seconds? God, Greg, you're always jonesing.
I'm not jonesing.
You're literally jonesing. You're jonesing in front of me.
I don't care about anything.
But I mean, okay. AI hasn't done anything. Well, it's done stuff. It's done a bunch of crazy shit. But it hasn't done anything like world changing yet. But it also ChatGPT didn't exist 4 years ago.
Yeah, but I mean,
there's the level of you look at like even if you listen to like Elon Musk, who would say what you will, talk about the AI singularity. 5 years ago, I know 2018. There's an interview with him, and he says like we're 20 years away. It's probably gonna be like 2045, but every year that time span gets cut in half.
Yeah.
So we're 40 years away today. We're going to be 35 years away next year. We're going to be yeah.
But this is a fallacy, right? Like
Moore's law. Yeah.
But it's like, yeah, like technology does not increase exponentially. It does reach a plateau at some point, right? It's like airplane travel hasn't gotten like faster and faster and faster and faster to the point where we can get to like New York in like, 35 seconds, right?
Well, I know, but the thing with AI is that it's an artificial intelligence. It's like an animal growing. It can infinitely.
No, because we understand now that there are like limits to like, because like AI doesn't know anything, right? It's just like rehashing things that it sort of can gather and sort of repackage in different ways. Like it's a predictive technology that regurgitates what already exists.
Do you know like the exact definition of the singularity? Where it starts replicating things that it alone understands because it's consumed like the entire corpus of human knowledge and then is developing on top of it. So it does things that it reaches a point where it does things that humans actually have no comprehension of. That's like the exact definition of what the singularity is.
But because it actually isn't thinking, this could very easily just produce nonsense or gibberish, like it'll convince itself. Well, I mean, it doesn't convincing itself of anything. It's fundamentally based on like predicting, and it's sort of like computer version of understanding. But because it doesn't have sort of like the human consciousness and the human like cultural knowledge to like understand the significance of what it's working with, and this is why like it keeps producing pictures of people with like 7 fingers and
like 6 months ago. Now they're perfect.
No, it's
I'm a little bit more if you're bearish on AI, I'm a little bit more bullish on AI.
Okay.
And good friends of mine, Matt Dryhurst and Holly Herndon, put it like this: that seeing visual images, seeing video, hearing audio, all of these kind of like cultural things that it's producing, right? They seem rather insignificant. It's writing poetry and so on. We should understand this as a tool with which to easily visualize the capacities of AI, and it's just an early demonstration that we can directly observe. So the actual use case, the practical uses of AI are going to be things that are far more abstract, things like protein folding, things like the fields of radiology, where, they're not necessarily... we're not asking them to synthesize something new. We're just asking them to do a very efficient task where before you would have to have several experts look at a scan to see if a tumor was benign or malicious and so on. And so once those things are sent to an AI that is trained off of the data of, several thousand experts who all review the scans, those are things that I think we should be really optimistic about. And to put this in a framework of a kind of political socialist tradition, one of the core problems of the 20th century, again, this knowledge problem, the economic calculation debate, the attempts that we had to solve this in Allende's Chile, experiments like CyberSyn, for example, which was, in fairness, it had the computational capacity of like a Game Boy. This is not a serious experiment, but if there was something that was theorized to be able to solve the knowledge problem, to know where all of these resources needed to go, to crunch enormous amounts of data, it is compute. And so the applications of AI for things that will be very pressing in the 21st century, not just the economy, but also simulating climate models that have these immensely complex, nearly irreducibly complex patterns. I am quite optimistic, actually. And I think that there's a lot of people today who are really skeptical of AI that come from the left. And I think that they're actually forgetting their own tradition, that, we have been historically people who are optimistic about technology. I think these things are kind of symptomatic of a long period of defeat. So I think that AI will be a pretty significant force. And looking at the silly memes and the videos and stuff, it's like a little cheesy and annoying, but we should hold out the possibility for, very significant implications in the future.
Well, that's interesting, because I do think you make a valid point. And the point that I was going to make before I got distracted by Greg's rampant
fiendish drug habit.
What did you just take, by the way? Sorry to cut you off.
I took an niacin.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, but it's true. It's like, I think that we can fixate a little too much on sort of the razzle dazzle manifestations of AI, the weird, pictures and chatbots and all this kind of thing, and sort of like downplay or kind of just ignore or be sort of oblivious to sort of like the less sexy kind of stuff that you're sort of describing, the efficiency improvements. But what I was going to say before I got distracted was that I think it's very possible that AI, instead of becoming this like world-changing sort of like thing that brings us forward to the techno-capital singularity or whatever, just winds up being something more like the consequences of introducing the internet, which is sort of like the skeptic case on the internet that I articulated earlier, which is, like it improves efficiency, like it helps us do things that we're already doing a bit better, maybe a lot better, but ultimately is not something that fundamentally changes the nature of life in as a profound way as like the invention of the airplane or something like that.
JJ will keep saying that until we all mute and merge into a singular being at the end of time.
I understand your frustration. I was at a bar and I had a conversation with a guy who was in Toronto for an AI convention, and he immediately started talking about how you're gonna get goggles that make a movie for you.
Oh, the goggles, guys.
It makes a brand new movie for you based on your entire preference and everything you've ever experienced, and tailors the perfect piece of media for you alone to consume. Versus the idea of like, okay, so schizophrenia medication, antipsychotics. There's no silver bullet with psychiatric disorders, right? When you take antipsychotics, it does a myriad of things that lower your psychosis, but it's like amongst a bunch of other detriments. Where AI could, and there already exists a 3D model, like a scan of not a scan, but like a recreation of a mouse's brain 1-to-1 in a computer. Could create a simulation of a human brain and then simulate thousands of medications and potential medications in a day. And then literally find a silver bullet for schizophrenia or depression or anxiety, where you're not taking Xanax, you're taking like, this does one thing, right? So there is like I guess it's like, how many problems do we need to solve? If you look at, we talk about the 20th century, like you can only 1900 to 2000, you go from 17% of people having a high school degree to 93%, right? You can only invent refrigeration once. Yeah. You can only educate the population once.
Yes.
How many more onces do we have that we need to solve?
Yes.
Like schizophrenia, cancer, a bunch of things that like we don't have answers for that we need. That would be a one and done. Like, once cancer is cured, there's no more cancer research. There's no more, like multi-billion-dollar industry and people going to school for 11 years become cancer. Like that industry disappears overnight.
Yeah.
Once cancer is cured with potentially AI.
Yeah.
Terry Fox Foundation goes out of business. Yes.
They'll all go to the fulfillment center. All those doctors, disemployed, got to fill boxes now. That's the only future for them.
I think what we're getting at is there's a huge amount of potential. I mean, if we can use AI to model the climate and help with climate change and stuff, that all sounds nice. But we're also seeing potential futures where AI becomes robots, technology in general just becomes oppressive in our lives and doesn't make our lives better, but just makes the line go up more. And that's kind of to the left accelerationist point, is like we're envisioning different potential futures if we're taking for granted that AI will be significant in our lives and do a lot of stuff. One of the futures is it gets all those one and dones done and life becomes better, and we can all kind of do whatever we want and be more or less live the same as we are living now.
Yeah, and that is the best. I agree with you. That is the best outcome. Is like, that it makes our lives better in like tangible but not dramatic ways.
Not so dramatic that we're all just we have nothing to do. Like in that case, then we can imagine a world where life is pretty much going on.
I think a lot of it, sort of to your point, Brogan, it depends like how many big problems do we still have to solve? Like how many fundamental, like climate change is obviously like the big one.
Is anyone aware the world is burning?
No,
but I mean, like
you're making that up.
But it's like, we're living like quite long lives. Like how long do we expect life expectancy to be?
Going down.
Like, do we?
It is decreasing, yeah.
But like we have a sort of like realistic sort of like understanding of how long a human can live under the most optimal conditions, and we've seen people live that long. More people have lived to be past 100 than ever before, and I think we have a sort of natural kind of sense that you can't live much more beyond like 120 or something. And even then your life capacity. So and it's like of the number like serious incurable diseases that like haunt large chunks of humanity, the number is relatively small. It's as small as it's ever been in all of human history, so
500-year-old Trump head in a jar. Wrong.
So yeah, it's like even in the best case scenario, right? Like, is it possible that, like you sort of say, like we only have to invent the refrigerator once? Like, are we at a point where just so many of like the big problems have already been addressed to some degree that sort of the even the best case scenario of what AI could do for us, how much would society be like meaningfully different in the aftermath of that? I don't know. But I think my suspicion would be that even in the best case scenario of how like where AI is maximally efficient and helps us sort of resolve some of humanity's kind of outstanding homework, I don't know. My instinct is that those problems are rather small in the grand scheme of things.
I have a little bit of hope for this, in that like the economic stagnation of the last few years, that climate technologies might be one of those things that actually increases productivity, increases growth, particularly direct air carbon capture technologies like this that are removing the negative externality of carbon, that those are not just, expanding sectors of the economy, but they may also meaningfully improve economic growth.
Type how to solve climate change in ChatGPT right now. No one's thought of this.
That's a good idea.
Fuck! Oh my god!
How to remove carbon from atmosphere. We'll invent carbon capture.
There's a great story about this, and if I recall correctly, in 2005, where there was a study done at a university in France that I don't remember the name of the particular academy right now, but to solve climate change, to compute an actually existing one-to-one model of climate scenarios, it would require a data center roughly the size of the city of Paris, and its energy consumption alone would be the single greatest contributor to climate change.
What irony. Let me tell you my vision of the future based off climate change. Okay, climate change gets worse and worse, a never-ending feedback loop.
AI doesn't fix it?
No, because we just discussed how if we're trying to fix it, it would cause more climate change, right? Everything that tries to solve climate change makes it worse. So it gets worse and worse. We have less and less resources. More war. Famines, the likes of which you haven't seen in 1,000 years. Climate refugees at the border. We elect fascists. The fascists go bracca at the climate refugees. France just deploys the military to shoot down the migrant boats. Dark world. The AI is extremely efficient, but it's all controlled by one guy, and his name is he's a bad guy. I don't know. And he has all the money, and everyone's poor and breathing poisoned air. And there's a meteor too. Fuck it.
And
Oh boy.
And me and you live comfortably in Toronto, Ontario.
Yeah, we'll be fine.
We'll be absolutely fine, and we'll make our little podcast.
Make a little podcast.
And get 2 crop cycles.
You hear what's going on in the news lately?
Wow, did you hear there's no more snow, but like the temperatures doesn't get that. It gets to like 35 in the summer, and there's no snow. Yeah. I can drive a motorcycle all year round now.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go left to right. You think that basically Canada will be fine because we'll have like 2 crop cycles, right?
Yeah, the Midwest, that's like the Midwest benefits from climate change, and parts of Russia do as well. But I agree with you. The climate refugee thing, yeah, it's like the people that are affected most also have nothing to start with in the beginning.
Yeah.
Right? India, Pakistan, parts of Africa, fucked. It's insane. I'm with you 100%.
Yeah.
I don't think that will boil over into North America.
Because we'll have to deploy the military to kill the climate refugees.
How do they gotta get here?
Bracca.
Where are they gonna,
we're not like in, coastal
Yeah,
Europe.
I'm just talking about this is why Europe has a bunch of fascists getting elected right now.
No, yeah, absolutely. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. All right. What do you think about my Pessimax future?
I think serious climate fallout, extreme weather, enormous FEMA camps, and a general disruption of supply chains and everyday life as we know it. Those things are distinct possibilities. We're seeing some of them now. And yeah, the fear of, not explicitly the fear of migrants or immigrants, but the economic impact of bringing in all of those people and labor supply and all of these things under conditions of austerity. Yeah, seal up the borders, Fortress America. Right-wing populists, they're very well positioned for all of this stuff.
Yeah.
So potentially scary future.
And you love migrants.
I think things are going to be just fine. Everything's going to be fine, kids. Don't worry. Don't listen to all the doomers. We need a new optimism. Optimism is what, got us through the Great Depression, got us through the Second World War, got us through the post-war age, the great age of, I made a video about this recently, sort of like the golden age of like post-war liberalism. It was a time of great optimism and pride and patriotism.
There's a good reason to be optimistic.
No, we didn't. I mean, half the world was destroyed, and we had just finished our second of 2 world wars in quick succession. If there was ever a time to be and we'd just seen the invention of terrible nuclear bombs that could blow up the world. If there was ever a time to be pessimistic, it was in like the 1950s. And instead, people chose to imagine a better world. People chose to be optimistic, to focus on what had made our civilization great in the past and what lessons we could learn of it, what sort of lessons we could learn from the failures of our enemies. It was an inspiring time, and I just don't understand why we can't find any sort of continuity with our optimistic tradition, and instead why we have to be so captive to the worst, fantasies of tomorrow.
I know, if only we could make things great again.
Yes, JJ wants to make things great again. I agree.
1950s.
No,
There was something that happened in that period, in the recovery of the Great Depression, a lot of this going on. There's a reason to be optimistic.
Yes, the big picture, I think optimism is important. Just no matter what situation you're in. I like, in terms of like, if you want to look at climate change from a pure scientific, just the news, there's a lot of bad trends, obviously. But there are also good trends. There are things that we're doing, and we're a plucky species, and I think just like the dispositional optimism is important, can make good things happen.
And it's like if you write it's worth noting, like if you write a story in the press today about why things have never been worse, that story will go viral. Everybody will share it because they'll feel clever and smart and, based, right? If you share a story that's like, we're making great progress on reducing plastic waste, like no one's going to share that story. Yeah. They'll think, oh, get a load of this nerd. He's being optimistic when the world's on fire. What a lame-o, right?
Do you know why so hurricane strength is increasing since we started modeling that in like 1960s? You know why?
Why?
Less smog.
Less smog.
Smog was disrupting hurricane strength. So now there's so little smog that hurricanes are back to. You hear about these great storms of like the 1890s? Yeah, that's what they were. There was the smog disrupted it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
The hurricanes are absolutely getting worse because of climate change.
It's smog.
The water's hotter.
It's like 0.2. Who cares? 0.2 degrees. That's nothing.
If there is a kind of optimism for this, some of the printing the money, this gesture, the Climate Restoration Corps, or a type of New Deal that particularly addresses climate technologies, renewable energies, and carbon capture. Those are sectors that are going to get a lot of money from the government. That's the printing mechanism. So there is a little bit of optimism as the climate scenarios get worse. It becomes more urgent to address. That puts a lot of people into jobs and technologies that can potentially address, the real effects of climate change. So there's a little white pill in the doomerism.
I feel like we should end this podcast by bukkakeing JJ with printing money.
I mean, that is the coming class consciousness, the emerging class consciousness is like, a right winger can't argue if they can't grow food or buy a house. The same way like a left winger can't argue, you're united on a front of hunger and cold, or hunger and heat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's probably a good place to. How long have we been going for?
We're almost at 2 hours. I do just want to say you guys are like our most educated.
Yeah.
Some of our most educated guests we've had so far.
Smart. And how old are both of you? Just remind the audience.
37. We're about the same age.
I'm actually a bit older. I'm turning 40 in a couple weeks. So yeah.
But we're like a half generation over.
Were you more radical when you were younger?
I probably was a little bit more radical. And I think, in fairness with the research and the podcast that I've done in the last few years, I met a lot of people who viewed the world very differently than I did. And my belief system was really challenged. I have a friend, Lee Phillips. He's a researcher on nuclear power. He was a big proponent of renewable energies like wind and solar and so on. And he was looking into nuclear power to debunk it. He was then convinced by what he saw in that process and changed his mind. So where I was probably
pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear?
Very pro-nuclear, pro-social democracy, pro-trade unions and industrial policy, which I'm very much aligned with. So I think probably my belief system, which is why I give these kind of provocations to left-wingers who are very comfortable in their like moralistic corner of viewing the world, unless you engage in conversation with people that you disagree with, you can't really know what you think because you can exist in this information echo chamber.
Yeah.
So having like a pro-complexity stance, being able to really address when you don't know an answer to a question. I was very challenged over the last few years. So I've probably moved a little bit closer towards the left of center. Ooh. But my political imaginary is this left accelerationist future of full automation. So I have like a kind of short-term vision, which is I think very practical, but the long-term vision is like I really believe in the importance of a utopian political imaginary. Because the problem of this constraint of the Overton window is that nobody has anything to believe in anymore. And if we can't have that optimism, we can't have a North Star that guides our political activities, then we're just going to end in this like slow downward, technocratic, managerial, incremental changes, rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. You know,
Can I ask you a provocative question,
Yeah.
Joshua? Because like you have I believe that sort of like personality is everything in life, and sort of like what our personality is what sort of disposes us to our political beliefs in many respects. It's sort of like what we were talking about a bit earlier. So like, do you think that, say, if you lived in an oppressive political system, do you think you would be a rebel against that system, or do you think that you would kind of like work within it? Like, do you think that you have the capacity to sort of be a brave radical?
Yeah, are some people just characterologically aligned with being anti whatever the status quo is? Like if I lived in China right now, would I be a libertarian?
Yeah.
That kind of personality. And I think probably as a young man and as an art student and someone who is educated in universities, I was much more within the belief system that I was basically acculturated into.
Yes.
And now I think I actually have a pretty different view. So I would say that, and this is why maybe this is a good place to end the podcast, because, you know, I've spent the last few years arguing on behalf of like extreme shit posters who say all sorts of things that I totally don't agree with.
Yes.
But I think people's belief systems are in motion. Exposure, challenging those ideas at an early level will lead them to worthwhile, serious engagement with politics later in life. So I don't want to discredit the people who are like, I'm a eco-extremist, a narco-primitivist, you know, whatever, Nazbol accelerationist bullshit. I think that's fine to do when you're like 12 and 13.
Yeah.
But when you are 22 and you're just working at the fulfillment center, you're probably going to be like, man, social democracy sounds really good right now. So I would say that I was much more like, yeah, I was an artist and an individualist, and I'm anti whatever the status quo is. And if I lived in China as an art student, I'd probably be like a, you know, libertarian freedom, whatever type of person. But now I really view the world very differently. And I mean, I think maybe the real test of ideology is when you make personal sacrifices for a vision that you'd like to see in the world. You know, and now at this point in my life, at age 37. I've had to make certain choices that maybe have been to my detriment, but is for a project that I believe in. You know, the willingness to sacrifice in some cases, like your own material comfort and upward mobility. I certainly don't make a lot of friends in university settings talking about stuff like this as we've done for the past 2 hours. But yes, I very much take that criticism seriously. And a lot of people who are self-professed radicals today are basically just, you know, it's a personality thing for them.
Yeah. No, I feel sort of broadly the same way about myself. I think like when I was younger, I kind of got off on being more sort of righteous and rebellious, because I do think that I had a bit of a, you know, a contrarian streak. I think I've always been relatively deferential to authority, though.
You still do have a bit of a contrarian
I do. But I mean, it was more obnoxious in those days.
I see.
But at the same, like, I'm kind of, I have a lot of contradiction, because like I've always been pretty deferential to authority, and I think that my contrarianism has often been in defense of the status quo and the sort of the standard way of doing things. But definitely, like, as I've gotten older, I've become more intimidated by the complexity of the world, and also just kind of like more aware of how repetitive history is and how few new ideas there truly are under the sun, and how like mankind just seems to be constantly just like struggling to relearn the same things over and over again, and how like you have, as an individual, no matter how righteous you are, you have a limited ability to sort of like influence that much, right? Which is why I think that I've become much more interested in just influencing people at a local level, at an individual level, like just picking battles carefully and trying to like be an informed advocate on like this issue or that issue, rather than sort of like sweepingly desiring to reshape the whole world before bedtime.
I'd hate any society I was born into. I don't give a frick. I just don't like reality. I'm like, put me in China, I'll be a libertarian. Put me in America, I'll be a communist. I don't care.
So you either end up poor or a social democrat NIMBY, and there's no in between.
And that's the horseshoe theory.
And that's the real horseshoe theory.